how to navigate a competition. Okay, so we in the public sector, kind of our public sector procurement professionals, have a slightly different job to procurement professionals within the private sector, in that there is this whole kind of piece around kind of legal obligations. Okay, so being a public sector procurement professional has a certain kind of role with it and certain things that people have to do, and often that's when you find you get kind of some strange language, some strange questions, a lot of what we describe as kind of red tape around kind of dealing with the public sector. So actually kind of, I'll try and give you an idea here of kind of some of the obligations that public sector procurement professionals actually have to have. So I mentioned a few seconds ago there, this thing around legal obligations. So the public sector has a kind of, and regulated procurement has a kind of a need to be fair and transparent. And whether that's under PCR 2015, the Public Contract Regulations 2015, or whether it's under UCR 2016, the Utilities Contract Regulations, or the Concession Regulations, CCR 2016, or the Defence and Security Regulations, which is slightly different. Now, these things, there's lots of them, and they're very, very complex. These are big, thick documents with lots and lots of regulations in them. So you can imagine getting that right, getting those legal obligations, making sure that they stay on the right side of that line is of absolute paramount importance to the public sector. So that's why we, when we're bidding into the public sector, we often have to kind of jump through several hoops and things like that. And it feels very difficult and very sticky and really quite kind of hard to, like, you're wading through treacle. And that's because of the legal obligations is one of the reasons, one of the drivers behind that. Second thing is kind of, which often is a kind of counterbalance to this, is commercial obligations. Okay, so as well as kind of like ticking the legal box and getting a compliance kind of box ticked, the public sector also has to look after things like value for money, achieving best value for money. You know, so they're spending public money, the public purse, taxpayers, our money. Every one of us is contributing to this. So they've got to make sure they're getting the best value for that particular money. And we often describe that in terms of kind of like technical and quality and the balance between the two, and commercial and price and all those kind of bits and pieces. So again, it's something we can talk about in a bit more detail in a few minutes, but that commercial obligation can often be at odds with a legal obligation. And it might be, well, if you did this in a more commercial way, you would have got a better deal, but it wouldn't necessarily be compliant with the regulations. So when we're bidding into the public sector, that can sometimes feel a bit strange and a little bit kind of backwards, the way that's kind of done. Other things on there, ethical kind of obligations. So honesty, integrity, impartiality, and objectivity. Those are the civil service values, I think, from memory, but ultimately most kind of public sector regulated spend buying organizations will have some kind of code of conduct, some kind of ethical code, and actually kind of, again, not dissimilar to the private sector, but it's something that's very kind of key in the public sector that you'll kind of come across, and you might see that in some of the tender kind of invitations that you receive. And finally, policy obligations. All organizations have policies. It's fairly kind of straightforward. The public sector has a lot of local policies. If you're bidding into the National Health Service, they're often called Standing Financial Instructions, SFIs, and they will have a section of rules of what you can and what you can't do within that organization. And we might cover off things like sustainability, supporting SMEs, small to medium enterprises, hopefully something you should all kind of be very aware of. There is this drive within government and drive within the public sector to do more with SMEs. Sometimes that doesn't quite kind of, you know, hit the mark, and obviously, which is why we have days like today to try and help kind of join these two things together. But there will be numerous policies. And so what you might find is that you are gauging the public sector, and they're talking about some obligations which are legal, regulatory obligations, and some which are more like policy, which are just local rules. So not legal, but things that they want to do and things that they have to do locally. And if you want a bit more information on this, the great news is it's all published. It's all in the public domain. So if you go to the gov.uk site and stick in the word procurement in the little kind of search box there, you will find a huge amount of information, probably more information than you want, really. Very, very detailed stuff, but all the regulations are on there, all the rules are on there, and kind of the stuff around kind of the changes as we're coming out of Europe and things like that, you know, which we'll talk about more in a minute. And how kind of organizations should be operating. So lots of stuff on there, probably too much for most of you, but that's where this all goes. And actually kind of, if you're working within the public sector, your expectation would be to go there and get that information from there yourself. So there'll be somebody in every team, in every procurement organization, in every department who are actually doing these things and taking this lead from the cabinet office who produces all this stuff. So that's the kind of start. That's a bit of context for you. Next thing to talk about is that how you actually kind of how the public sector accesses the marketplace, and this is where we start to use some very specific kind of wording here and phrases and things. So let's come up with the first couple of things here. So an open or restricted tender. So usually there's something called an ITT, an invitation to tender. And the two processes we're talking about here are very much a kind of an open tender is something where the contracting authority, the public sector organization, will cast the net wide, and they will basically kind of, it's a come one, come all, everybody's welcome, apply, and it's what's called a single stage event. So they will look at your bids, they will evaluate those, and then they'll select a winner. Now, a restricted tender is very similar, but it's called a two-stage event. So they will cast the net wide and they say, well, actually, we're only going to take forward the five most, as an example, the five most suitable suppliers or potential suppliers. And then we want those suppliers to bid against our specific requirement. So rather than them having to evaluate 100 tenders, 100 bids, and potentially waste the time of those kind of applicants, people like yourselves, actually they'll say, well, we're only going to look at the best five. So just send us some background information, who you are, what you're about, tell us you're interested, and then we'll down select to five, and then you can bid properly against those kind of requirements. And so that's a restricted tender, so you might see those kind of things around. I'll get to the picture on the right-hand side there about what Finder Tender and Contracts Finder is in a moment. There's a horrendous thing called the competitive dialogue. Competitive dialogue is more akin to kind of private sector procurement, where it's a kind of an ongoing backwards and forwards negotiation over a period of time. The big downsides of competitive dialogue is that these things take a lot of time. So 6, 12, 18 months is not unusual for a competitive dialogue. And actually, when you're kind of doing competitive dialogue, the cost to actually bid into that kind of process has been estimated to be about £1 million per bidder who's actually bidding, plus the transactional cost of the contracting authority who's actually running that process is very expensive as well. So it's a very, very big kind of thing. It's usually only done for very big projects, very difficult projects, and you're probably seeing less and less of these kind of things advertised. What I would suggest is if you do see a competitive dialogue kind of advertised, have a really good read of it before you decide whether you're going to bid or not, because this thing might go on for 18 months. So really do be aware of that. And those kind of things are usually, you'd be invited to those by something called an invitation to negotiate, an ITN, rather than an invitation to tender, an ITT. A more slimline version of this, it's a little bit of a kind of a hybrid between the two, is something called competitive procedure with negotiation. And again, this is usually an ITN, and it's a bit like an open or restricted tender, just as I was talking about before, but there's a period of negotiation usually at the end of the process. So you aren't allowed to negotiate under the open or restricted tender. You are under competitive dialogue, and you are under the competitive procedure with negotiation. And I know that sounds quite strange, because you would think, well, every contract I've signed in my life, there's been a bit of negotiation around. It's very, very normal. The public contract regulations are very strict about what you can talk about, what you can't. And again, there's too much detail there to go into for today's session. But be very clear about what you can and can't do, and the clues are in the name of what type of procedure we are talking about here. An organization, a public sector organization, may be setting up something called a framework, which is a kind of a buying agreement. It's not a contract, it's like an agreement or an arrangement, it's called. And what a framework is it's kind of like they do all the heavy lifting up front. So with a framework, they try and get these kind of things set up front, get all the suppliers on them who can deliver that, and then they will do formal competitions, smaller competitions off that, or maybe something called a direct award. Frameworks can be really good to get yourself onto. It's a big thing to get awarded a place on a framework, and because it gives you an access, it gives you access to that kind of department who's named on the framework, or that body who's named on the framework. But equally, what it does as well is it allows those contracting organizations a legally compliant route to market, which means they don't have to go out via these big tenders. They can do something called a further competition, or a direct award, as we were saying a few seconds ago. Again, frameworks, very complicated, very interesting. Really do read the detail about how they're set up. And the health warning here is that you might find that you actually spend as much time tendering for a framework to win a place on the framework as you would for a specific contract, but you actually get no work at the end of it because there is no commitment to spend under a framework. It's purely a vehicle to access the marketplace. So again, something you need to think about kind of if you're bidding into that area, how much time and effort you're going to put into it. Actually, it could be a huge money spinner for you. It could be a really, really big kind of thing for you, but actually you might not win anything from it. So, you might put a lot of effort in and get nothing back. Again, just a caveat to think about these things. Then you might get something called below thresholds. When we talk about thresholds, we're talking about the kind of what used to be the OJU thresholds. For some of you who may have heard that. And we're talking here about the kind of the levels above which competition is mandatory, is required by the law. And here we're talking about thresholds like 112,000 and 120,000, 160,000. There's various different ones. Again, too many to go through on today, but you want to look for those kind of wordings around kind of threshold and above threshold or below threshold. Now, as a very kind of quick summary, you can see on the slides there's something called Find a Tender. Find a Tender is the portal for the high value stuff, the stuff that's above threshold. Generally speaking, Contracts Finder is the portal for the lower value stuff below threshold. And I'm being slightly woolly in here because we're in this kind of transition period where we've left the EU and the old OJU regs are kind of over here. The regs are still in place, but there's a number of changes around them. So we're in like a hybrid at the moment. And there is a new version of the regulations coming where they're going to squish together all of those 4 types of regulations I described earlier on, produce a new set of single regulations for dealing with the public sector. And that's going to have IT systems and portals and things like that associated with it. It may be very similar to what's there now. It may be quite different in some areas, and we don't know exactly what that's going to look like at the moment. So again, if you are above threshold, you can think about it's going to be a high value thing. If it's below threshold, it's going to be a low value, and you might just be doing something like what's called an RFQ, a request for quotation. An RFQ is generally below threshold. It can be low value, and we sometimes talk about getting 3 quotes. That's an RFQ. Give me a quote and I'm going to go with the cheapest. That kind of thing. Very less interested in your technical solution, more interested in the price. But again, there could be a technical element to it as well, depending on what the nature of the organization and what they're asking you for. So again, something to kind of look at there and something to think about. Now, there's this other weird and wonderful thing called grants, and that's entirely different. So grants aren't contracts. They're not covered by the procurement regulations. They are something different. So be careful when you're looking at things to see whether you're looking for something that is a grant or whether it's actually a kind of a proper procurement project, and we'll have a contract at the end of it. Grants is basically a contracting authority, a kind of an organization, a body is giving you money to do something for you, to do something for them, but it's not in the same way as it would be for a contract. So it's not a legally binding contract. It is something where effectively kind of you will be expected to do something for that money. So it might be, for example, I'm trying to think of some examples of this. It might be cleaning up an area of waste ground. It might be something where it's not, for example, going out to a professional cleaning company and doing a contract for it. It might be that actually kind of a government organization like DEFRA is trying to improve the local environment, so is giving grants out to small bodies and small companies and small kind of VCSEs and things, just to actually give them some money to help, to try and help promote something in that area, such as a cleaner, kind of safer living environment for everyone in the community, something along those lines. So it's usually a lot looser. Really, really interesting. In the last 10 years, this is where there is an overlap into procurement here. In the last 10 years, some government departments and some public sector bodies have been running their grants program as if they were doing procurements. So they are basically almost asking you to bid into that grant program, and then they will evaluate it as the same way they would evaluate a bid and then award on that basis. So again, not contracts in the same way we think of procurement, but sometimes following a very, very similar process. Very, very interesting about that kind of overlap. So again, just look for that word. If it's a grant, it will be very clear. We'll say it's a grant. So kind of you have something you can watch out for there. And the final point I just want to make here on this slide is just this point about a procurement cycle. So these things go round and round and round. Some of these things are going to be kind of like really quick. Some of them are going to be kind of like 3-year contracts, 1-year contracts, 10-year contracts, but they go round and round and round. So you will see, if you work in an industry for long enough, you'll see the same kind of contracts coming up again and again. Usually with different organizations, but sometimes in the same organization if they recompete every 3 to 5 years, which is not essential under the regulations, but it's something that most organizations will do, is do these kind of shorter term kind of contracts. Some quick stuff here about how to navigate a competition. So here are the things that you can do before, sorry, there are things you can do before a competition is launched. And really what we want to talk about here is this idea about being as prepared as possible. So you know they're going to ask you about your financial stability. They know they're probably going to ask you for references. Most portals now, most electronic portals for actually kind of tendering with the public sector have a section on them where you can fill out all the selection questionnaire questions. So like, who are you? What's your company's house number? Kind of what's your registered address? What are your insurance levels? All these kind of things. You can get these all in place up front. So then when you do actually come to tender or to bid into a piece of work, that's already there. You've already got that information there. And it's either just a case of confirming that that's correct or copying and pasting it across depending on how the portal's set up. So there are lots of things you can do. And I always encourage people to kind of get as prepared as you can, because they're going to ask you these kind of questions, whether it's a huge contract or a smaller contract. They're going to want to know what your insurance levels are. So you may as well have copies of those certificates ready. And if you can upload them onto the portal, fantastic. Do that up front. Collect references as you go. There's all kinds of things that you can kind of do there. And equally, the kind of second part of this is that the contracting authority, on a run up to launching a tender, may well do a industry day, so a market engagement day or pre-market engagement day. And what they might want to do is they might say, well, we know we want to buy something that looks roughly like this, but we're not absolutely sure. So what they're going to do is they're going to talk to all parties that they can in the marketplace. And they're going to say, well, actually, kind of like, we're going to do a bit of engagement. We need to be fair to everybody. We're going to be transparent. We're going to use this conversation to kind of shape the specification. Okay, and what it's not going to be an opportunity for you to try and influence and duly influence the buyer, or to share. It's not the right place to share your commercial strategy, but it's kind of like an engagement day thing. So if these things come up, if you see these things, I would strongly encourage you to attend. A lot of them are done now because of COVID. You're using webinars and Zoom and things like that, like today. So that's great. You can go and see them. Equally, if you sign up for these, even if you can't make it, a bit like today, what organizations often do is make recordings available. So much easier than when it used to be a meeting in a physical room. Again, those things will happen as well still, but actually this is something I'm seeing a lot more of this over the last kind of 18 months, people doing these kind of things. Okay, so that's how to navigate the basics of a competition.